coming from you today from a Wurundjeri Wurrung country, and that this land is stolen land, and it never has, and it hasn't been ceded. Yeah, I'm going to talk a bit and then show a video. So I'll just bring it up. Just to provide a little context, I'll briefly explain how I came to the refrain and why it became significant to my arts practice. The refrain is a term most simply understood as a recurring phrase or verse, a repetition. My postgraduate research focused on how the reverberating shimmer of my family's history during World War II emerged as a forceful presence in my arts practice. Specifically, it focused on how my maternal grandmother seemed to bear the material weight of this history, and how her repeated utterance of the Czech expression Ježiš Maria made this history present to me. The refrain would punctuate daily life and carry with it the history of the Holocaust into the present day through the transmission of semiotic language. Deleuze and Guattari have attributed the refrain with functions that are as slippery and subversive as public pedagogy. Firstly, they suggest a sense of familiarity is formed through a pattern of repetition of the refrain, also proposing that this has a calming function because we are consoled by repetition. It becomes a kind of portable homeland. They uncharacteristically evoke the sentimental image of a child singing to himself in the dark. Maybe we were all this child at points in time as we faced the unprecedented and unknown realities of adjusting our lives to a world beset by COVID-19. Secondly, Deleuze and Guattari propose that the refrain is a territorial assemblage. They frequently describe how a bird marks out its territory, and Paul Elliott describes how it is the circle or the yard that we draw around us. The refrain delineates and describes the territory. It keeps others at bay, while at the same time outlines a perimeter or a safe zone. Think of the bird singing or the dog barking. He proposes that the singing of a crowd at a football match is as much a spatial act as a psychological one. Before COVID reached our shores, I think many of us will recall the powerful scenes of individuals singing from their balconies in Italy as hard lockdowns were imposed. They created a territorial assemblage through harmonic song. In Britain, there was collective clapping to thank the NHS workers, and here in Melbourne and elsewhere around the world, we adorned our windows with rainbows and teddy bears as we mapped out very familiar but newly demarcated routes in our neighbourhood. Not technically a refrain, but we were beginning to have a realigned spatial understanding of public and private as we scrambled to create a sense of familiarity and community during a sustained period of separation. The third function of the refrain is its flight out of this demarcated territory. Elliott suggests that in order for a home to be recognised, that it must be constantly held in comparison with a route out. A return, even in a musical sense, can only exist if there is an equal force away from it. I propose that the refrain provides an interesting and powerful model for thinking about public pedagogy and forms of togetherness. It seems to me that at its core, public pedagogy has a desire for forms of togetherness, engaged communities, and interconnected publics, but also reminds us, in the words of Glenn Savage, that public is not one thing. Different publics exist in multiple and intersecting iterations, and each carries a distinct pedagogical forms and potentials. Additionally, at the heart of public pedagogy is the desire to not just tinker at the structural and intersecting inequalities, but to completely pull them apart and form new assemblages. What is particularly important about the refrain is that it is never fixed or stable because it is always in motion. It is this mutability and the unrest it creates that is its line of flight, a constant and a repetitive scoring over that allows the decks to be reshuffled and new patterns to emerge. It provides an interesting model for thinking about how we return to a state of public togetherness and belonging after the separation of the pandemic. It also helps us to understand that we are never fully together or apart in public space. Importantly, the flight out is also political. It demands expanded thinking, resistance, and sites of protest, and for these processes to be continually reforming and realigning into multiple and intersecting iterations of forms of togetherness and separation. Whilst reflecting on the refrain as a model for public pedagogy, and in the context of presenting at this conference, it became important to ask whether the very concept of public pedagogy has any place within an institutional setting, specifically in the tertiary and arts and design sector, or is such a setting necessarily the antithesis to the very ethos of public pedagogy, an ethos that carries distinct pedagogical forms and potentials, but at its heart seems to aspire to be more equal and diverse and freed from the institutional constraints of formal education. Can we find a space within tertiary education where there are non-linear, non-hierarchical and unquantifiable modes of learning? I'd like to speak to a time in the early 2000s when I myself was a student and there was a series of collectives or forums that sat outside the university curriculum. Many went back beyond this time, such as DAMP, which was established in 1995 and originally formed as a drawing workshop at the VCA. DAMP continues today and has maintained a fluid membership over the years, with alumnus numbering over 70. Rosemary Ford describes how in the face of 1990s privatisation of higher education and increasing dominance of individualism in art and culture, groups of students were encouraged by their teacher, Jeff Lowe, to collaborate and define ways of working together rather than competing against each other. You could surmise that each of these groups, while unique in their approach, emerged from a similar political time and response from artists and academics. There was also Remedy, which was formed in 2003 by John Campbell and Kim Donaldson, and it was a performative-based initiative that later became FIX. I will return to the most reiteration of FIX later as a way of concluding this paper. Art and Text was also a forum that sat outside the university curriculum and its broader economy. It was facilitated by Dr. Bernard Sachs, who passed away earlier this year. Bernard is a figure who recurred throughout my student life, both as an undergraduate participant in Art and Text and later during postgraduate research. In speaking about Art and Text, I'm reflecting on my own student experience. Importantly, no attendance hurdles or assessment rubrics were required, and as such, its work and purpose were harder to quantify. Students turned up at lunchtimes on Fridays and attempted to grapple with Bernard's vast intellectual and artistic knowledge that was shared so generously and always with his own unique anarchic wit. For many of us, it was our first introduction to the intersection between art and theory. Bernard began with a series of introductory lectures, and it was a deep dive into the world of language and representation, the studium and punctum, and the meaning of semiotics. Personally, it became foundational to later postgraduate research. In the following week, students would present work for critique. Although deeply theoretical, it was always studio-based and focused on the art. Each of us presenting or responding to work on a weekly basis. Many of us repeating the following year, not as a failure, but as there was more to be gained from a type of learning that was not hierarchical, linear, or measurable. It is important to note that it was open to all students across the art school, and perhaps one of the most significant aspects of Art and Text, Remedy and DAMP was that this is where we connected with students from other areas within the art school, and deep relationships and collaborations were forged. The details of the lectures and works presented in Art and Text are now somewhat of a hazy memory, although Bernard always started with the treachery of images by Belgian painter René Magritte. When Bernard passed away earlier this year, his wake occurred at a time where we were stuttering and stammering our way out of the pandemic-riddled world and re-emerging in public space. It was mine and many others' first re-entry into public life and space. Together we stood, talked, laughed and remembered in a crowded room, the noise and chatter of a harmonic refrain. Many of these faces I see regularly in my art, work and social life. Some had not been seen for many years, and yet there was a deep, calming, sustaining familiarity. This was not built through required attendance, but through willing participation participation and unquantifiable engagement. As mentioned above, around the same time of Art and Text, there was also Remedy, which was formed by John Campbell and Kim Donaldson. Now called Fix, this performance-based initiative continues to be driven by current students from VCA and is now loosely facilitated by Dr. Lisa Radcliffe. I say loosely because it is this looseness that is important. In fact, Lisa cautioned me, if you call it public pedagogy, it will kill it. So I won't use that term, and I will let the works I will show shortly by current and past VCA staff and students speak for themselves. Like Art and Text and DAMP, the format of Fix sits outside of the curriculum. Students and staff contribute their time, work, vulnerability, and their performative and political bodies to an activity that sits outside a matrix of academic success and future employability. Importantly, it continued during the pandemic. 3 students, Joseph Doggett-Williams, Adina Kraus and Ciro Cavallero, kept Fix alive during multiple lockdowns via Instagram and a hydro tent. It is well known that Melbourne weathered some of the most sustained lockdowns in the world during the pandemic. The hydro tent kept the performances rolling and live streamed during this isolation, a virtual and portable public space. The most reiteration of Fix 007 occurred at the Fiona Sidney Meyer Gallery alongside an exhibition Bodies created by David Sekira. This exhibition marked the 50th anniversary of the VCA by exhibiting works by early generations of students at the National Gallery Art School and included playlists devised by current students. These bodies, past and present, became the backdrop to host the material, political and tender bodies of Fix 007. These bodies came together in harmonic togetherness and discordance of the separation of the pandemic. It was a night of full-bodied aliveness and presentness, and it embodied a sense of deep care and recovery. I'll not be able to cover all the works presented, but I'd like to give a sense of how the night unfolded. A night of beautiful, challenging, moving, vulnerable, material bodies in public space. Kathleen Stewart writes that a refrain is a scoring over of the world's repetitions, a scratching on the surface of rhythms, sensory habits, gathering materialities, intervals and durations, a ganglia accrual of slow or sudden accretions. The refrain is a form of togetherness that is moving in real time, overlapping with meaning and feeling, and always leaving space for a flight out to commence again and form a new rhythm that will pulse both in and out of time. And if you could share the video now, Bruce, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Are you able to see that?
Yep.
Okay.
It is quite a surreal time, both sort of normal and completely not at the same time. It was a weird pandemic vibe. Haha, I know. I wasn't genuinely offended. Exercise is good for the mind right now. Yeah, that's true. At least we have a community of connection and meaning to share ideas and images and concepts with each other. Definitely an enriching space. Thanks, and to you too. The sunflower emoji was funny, as that's the title for a few works I have made in the current series. Hierarchy of desire. I'm Rita. Feel the pulse of the thing that you make. Slow burn. Seduced or seducer. The pulse of the world in this precious time.
Thanks, Bruce. Thank you. I'll just make a few concluding comments. That the final performance in this video was a performance by Nadia Herdanzis and John Campbell that concluded the evening of Fix 007. Nadia and John recently presented speech patterns together at the Art Gallery of Western Australia. Curator Robert Cook states that while emerging from different cultural and generational experiences, their practice share a powerful commitment to the grain and poetry of a yearning for equality and grassroots resistance. Perhaps maybe a yearning for public pedagogy, if this term can survive its own limitations. I'm going to quote some text from speech patterns to contextualise their collaboration and explain this connection to public pedagogy. Nadia and John both mobilised the rhythms, harmonies and dissonances of written, spoken and pictorial language to deal with experiences of relocation, questions around identity, class, cultural and national value systems. Within this, they offer their own voices in both direct political protest and in celebration and critiques of everyday life, values and relationship. For Hernandez, born in Merida, Venezuela, and now based between Melbourne and Sydney, her practice is a way of keeping alive her connection to friends, family and place, while calling on the spirit of protest to unsettle the global disorder that has displaced her and her family. And for Campbell, born in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and growing up in Melbourne's western suburbs, his work is wildly humorous explanation of the layered and complicated contingencies of the ever-shifting Australian condition as it is embraced, repressed and rebelled against. To conclude, I'd like to tentatively suggest that both artists are enacting a refrain, carrying with them a portable homeland that provides comfort and familiarity while simultaneously shifting in and out of time and performing moments of resistance and protest. Together, they perform a poetics of togetherness, separation and rebellion, a togetherness performed and shared in public space. Thank you.